Good evening, gentlemen. Good evening. We are, with God's help, studying tonight the last chapter of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, chapter 12. My plan, God willing, if all else goes, if everything works out, my plan is that we should start and finish this chapter tonight. This is a very short chapter, very straightforward relative to everything else we've been learning. Next week, God willing, we will do a summary and review of the whole Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. And the week after that, we are moving onwards and upwards, God willing, something new, now for something completely different, as Monty Python would say. In chapter 11, we learned that even God's speech is absolutely one with Him. Not just the divine traits, not just the chesed, not just the kindness or the ratzon, the will, not just the divine traits are absolutely one with Him, but even the divine speech which expresses those divine traits, even the specific divine expressions which create particular creations, such as let there be light, even let there be light is absolutely one with godliness. From God's perspective, there's no difference between let there be light and let there be a firmament, for example, right? The first and second day of creation. From God's perspective, all of these things are absolutely one. And now we are going to move on to chapter 12, which, just like chapter 11, essentially expresses a single point. The single point, the central thesis of chapter 12 is that the unity of the divine speech is not just in the divine speech, but it is in the creations themselves that the divine speech creates. In other words, not only is let there be light absolutely one with God, but the light that it creates is exactly the same. The light that it creates is absolutely united with Him, and so too let there be a firmament, etc., etc. In this sense, gentlemen, as we will, God willing, discuss more next week in review, Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, the second part of Tanya, is a perfect circle. We start discussing at the very beginning about how everything that exists in our world is created by the speech of God, and the speech of God is constantly being spoken, and that's what is constantly creating everything that exists. And chapter 12 ends on the exact same topic. Chapter 12, we come back to talking about how all of the creations are created from the divine speech. This is not by accident. The entire book is designed in this way. The Alter Rebbe designed the second part of Tanya it's essentially, as we'll discuss more next willing God week, it's called the technical literary term, which is almost useless outside of this context. It means a very specific thing. The technical literary term is a chiasmus, or a chiasmus. But what that means is essentially it's like a pyramid. The structure of the Tanya is the two bottom legs of the triangle talk about the same thing, and then you move your way up and up. And the peak of the triangle is chapter 7. Chapter 7 is the turning point. So the entire Tanya, I'll, God willing, have some kind of image to illustrate this next week. But the second part of the Tanya, the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, starts talking about the world, works its way up to talk about God, the infinite God before all creation, and then from there it works its way back down to talk about the world. So the Tanya has two parts. There's a climbing up towards God and a coming back down to the world from God. And the general gist of this part of the Tanya is that the unity with God is from both directions. The unity of the world with God, which is the theme, that's what this book is about, how the world is united with God, that reality is from both directions. That reality is from the world working up to God, and it's also from God working down to the world. A different way of saying this is that the first half of the book is discussing how everything is godly. The second half of the book is discussing how godliness is everything. Right? Als is elokus and elokus is als, as we say in Yiddish. Right? These are the two halves of the philosophy of Chassidus. One starts with the world and shows how far you can go in godliness from the world. And the other starts with God, and it shows how God remains God even as he descends and contracts himself to create a world. And the turning point is in chapter 7, where we discuss the two types of unity, the higher level unity and the lower level unity, and the non-literal tzimtzum. That's where we made the turn to come down the other side of the pyramid. But we'll discuss all of that more next week. This week we have chapter 12. Chapter 12 is relatively straightforward. We're going to read and have just a little bit of explanation. And we can actually, it'll be nice because it's a rare occasion where we can encapsulate a whole chapter in a single hour, God willing. May I borrow someone's watch? I need to be able to keep the time here. Thank you very much. Perfect. Yeah, that works. That works just as well. Okay. So without further ado, let us start the final chapter of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, the second part of the Tanya. The Rebbe has various, by the way, if anyone wants to go afterwards and read the Rebbe's interspersed commentary on this chapter, there's various interesting points. They're more, especially in the essay at the end, as you'll see, at the end of this chapter, like several of the other chapters in Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, there's a whole comment from the Rebbe. We're going to touch on it inside, but it's, as you'll see, it all enriches the chapter. I just don't want to go without mentioning that these comments of the Rebbe enrich the chapter. So again, the theme of chapter 12, what we are learning about tonight is that not only is the divine speech absolutely one with God, but the result of the divine speech, so to speak, what the divine speech is constantly creating, namely the creation is absolutely one with God as well. So without further ado, L'chaim. Zok the Heilige Alter Rebbe, the Holy Alter Rebbe says, Rak she'habruyim mischakim lemineim b'cholos u'befratos. We ended the previous chapter saying that God creates the world with the 22 letters of the divine speech. Continues the Alter Rebbe. The creatures of the world, the creations, are divided into categories, both general and particular, al yedei shinuyei hatzirufim v'chilufim v'tmuras kanal, through the changes in the arrangement, exchanging, and transpositions of letters, as we said above. In other words, even though, right, here's the fundamental question. This chapter is a question and an answer. The question is, we see only 10 divine utterances and 22 letters in the Holy Tongue, and these create the multiplicity, the infinite multiplicity, the infinite different types of things that exist in the creation. How do you go from 10 divine utterances, let there be light, let there be a firmament, etc., and 22 divine letters, the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet? How do you go from these so to speak, limited divine expressions, these very small numbers of things, 10 and 22, how do you go from these things to the infinite multiplicity of creation? That's the question of the chapter. The answer of the chapter is that all the properties, all the qualities of each one of those infinite different creations is purely an expression of different combinations of those 22 letters. All differences, all qualitative differences in the world derive from different combinations of those 22 letters. In other words, there are, there's a million different types of insects, right? A billion, I don't know what it is, but there's many.
8 million.
8 million different types of insects, thank you. So, the 8 million different types of insects, where do those 8 million different types derive from? They derive from different arrangements of 22 letters. In the previous chapter, we learned that the differences in those 22 letters, distinguishing one of the divine utterances from another, Yehi from Yehi Rakia, for example, right? Let there be light from let there be a firmament. The differences in those letters is, from God's perspective, immaterial. There is no difference. right? So now we are simply making a logical connection. If, number one, the qualities of everything in the world derive from different combinations of these letters, and number two, from God's perspective, there is no difference in between the different combinations of these letters. He sees them as all just a pure expression of godliness. Therefore, we must conclude that all the differences between all the different creations, the 8 million different types of insects, from God's perspective, what is there? There is a divine unity. There is only a God. Right? You followed that? I think it's pretty straightforward. It's connecting a chain. Previous chapter, we say all the different types of divine expression are one. Here we're saying all the differences in the creation derive purely from the differences in the divine expression. Therefore, the differences in the divine in the creation are really one. From his perspective, he sees no differences in the creation. He sees a unity with him. He sees just a divine expression. Okay? So as the Alter Rebbe says in these first two lines, how do we get the multiplicity of the creation? We get them through the different combinations of the letters, combinations, substitutions, and transpositions of the divine letters. Ki kol eis hi hamshachas chayes v'keach meyuchad prati, because each and every letter draws forth a divine life force and power that is particular to that letter. In other words, each letter is a different reflection of the divine, right? And as explained in Kabbalah, the 22 letters are really just a different way of expressing the 10 spheres. The 10 divine traits and the 22 letters are really the same type of thing. The letters, 22 different letters, express the 10 divine traits. And the 22, so each one of the letters is a different way of expressing those divine traits. And when you join many letters together to create a word, aside from the many types of life force that you are drawing forth according to the number of letters in the word, right? So if you have a word, shulchan, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 letters, right? If you count the vav, which you don't always, by the way. But if you count the vav, 5 letters. The word shulchan, the word for table, right? Or kaisis, cup, has 3 letters. Or even, stone, has 3 letters, right? So you have let's do a stone, because again, the human artifacts confuse people. So let's just use a stone. You have an even, 3 letters. 3 different letters are 3 different divine life forces. You have an aleph, a beis, and a nun. And these 3 life forces put together yield a stone. But it's actually slightly more complicated, as Alter Rebbe is about to say. In addition to the 3 life forces of the letters that are in the stone, continues the Alter Rebbe, furthermore, 2 lines from the bottom of page 986, Ha'ele al kulana, transcending all of them, above all of these 3 powers, hamshachas keach elyon v'chayos klali, there is the drawing forth of a higher power and a general life, which includes and is equivalent to all these particular life forces of the letters, and exceeds all of them. It unites them and combines them together. In order to grant power and life force to the world in its general and particular respects.
So in Gematria, when you say a kolel, this is what it means?
That's one of the, that's one of the things.
Including the word itself.
That the word itself counts as one, right? Yes. What the Alter Rebbe is saying is really not so, the idea anyway, the basic idea is not so difficult to understand, not so abstract, right? The example Rabbi Yoel gives is the phrase that we say every day in davening, Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam, which means, blessed be the one who spoke and the world came into being, and the world was, right? Baruch she'amar v'haya ha'olam. Says Rabbi Yoel, very simply, that in each of these, for example, in each of the words of this phrase, there is a particular energy that is different from the others. Baruch means blessed, She'amar means spoke, V'haya means and was, Ha'olam means the world. Each one has a different energy, each word, right? But none of them, if just adding those energies together, does not give you, blessed is he who spoke and the world came into being. right? You can't, in other words, what he's saying is that the sentence, Baruch She'amar V'haya Ha'elam, is more than the sum of its parts. You can't just add the parts together and get the whole. You can't put, it's not blessed plus world and was and what am I missing? And says, and put them all together, and you get a even in the correct order, unlike I just said them. And you still don't get the actual semantic meaning of the sentence, right? The whole is more than the sum of the parts. When you put them together in a sentence, the sentence contains a meaning that is not present in any of the words. They contain a meaning together that individually summed they do not have, right? So the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. That's Rabbi Yoel's metaphor for what the Alter Rebbe is talking about, which is that when you have the word Even, Aleph has an energy, Beis has an energy, Nun has an energy, but then there is a higher life force that God uses to put these three together and make it into a stone, which is not included in any of the letters. There's an additional, there's a kolel, there's an inclusive power which puts these things together into one soul and one essence. That's what the Alter Rebbe said.
But why the amount of letter counts?
What do you mean?
Because he's saying, the ribu otiyot.
Yeah, because the ingredients are still the letters, right?
So you take Sela, Tzuk, Even.
Yeah.
3 letters. Then you take Har, mountain.
Right. It's 2 letters, but it's much bigger, right? I understand. But the what he's saying is that according to the number of letters is the number of energies in the etzem. He doesn't mean ribui b'kamus. He doesn't mean more in quantity. Mm-hmm. He means more in complexity. Let's put it that way. More in complexity of the spiritual ingredients that go into making this thing, right? So. Just an interesting note that Chassidus in the many of the deep Maimarim talks about how in the human being there is a similar capacity when we speak. The example the Rebbe Rashab gives is that different great rabbis, like let's say the Rambam and the Ran, right? 2 Rishonim. You have the Rambam and the Ran or the Rosh, right? You could pick all these different medieval halachic deciders, whichever one you want, the Rabbeinu Nissim, the Rabbeinu Asher, the Rambam, right? They come and they say the same idea often, right? Because they have their own works, but they're saying the same idea. But when they say the same idea from the Talmud, they'll say it in different words. It's the same idea, different words, right? So how can it be that the same idea comes in different words? After all, it's the same idea. Explains that the reason the same idea comes in different words has nothing to do with the idea itself, because otherwise there would be the same words, because it's the same idea. Rather, the combination of different words that each person chooses is deeply reflective of a power of their soul that is actually above the intellect. Again, the choices of words that we use to express the same idea, those choices actually derive from a part of the soul that is above seichel itself. It is above the intellect itself. So our choice of words reflects us in an even deeper way than the actual idea that we are saying. The Rambam has something in his neshama which makes him choose certain words, and the Rabbeinu Nissim has something in his neshama which makes him choose certain words. So we see even in human speech, according to Chassidus, there is this idea of the Eila al Kulana. It's not just individual ideas or individual pieces that always yield the same result. There is a sort of a gelling factor, something that makes the pieces come together in a certain order and in a certain way to produce a certain result that comes from a very deep place. It comes from a deeper place than the idea itself.
That would apply if somebody writes like an essay, but some expressions are like ready-made, like it says somebody good morning.
Right.
Right. Everyone is going to say the same words.
Right. So it's a question of whether, it's a I'm sure when the Rambam and Rabbeinu Nissim daven, they said the same words as well. Right. It was when they had to ascribe their own words to a certain idea that this difference became clear. Okay. Haggah. There's a footnote here. Slightly mysterious, in the sense that it's not 100% clear to me. I don't 100% understand. Even after reading Rabbi Yoel's commentary on this chapter, I don't 100% understand what this note is here to add. But let's read the footnote. Okay. Haggah, note. Second line of page 987. Ulafisha kol eis ve'eis mechaf ve'eis yasateri yam shachas chayas v'keach miyuchad prati. Since each and every letter of the 22 letters of the Torah is a specific, particular life force, she'ena nimshach be'eis acheres, which is not found in any other letter, lekach gam tmunasan bichsav kol eis hi betmunas miyuchedes pratis. So, therefore, the form of each letter, he means the physical form, the way the letter is written in the Torah, is in a certain and particular shape. Which refers to the form or the shape of the divine energy and the revelation of the divine light and vitality and power which is revealed through that letter. How it is drawn forth and revealed from God and His will and His wisdom. This note essentially adds that the form of the letter reflects its nature. Which is why you have many svarim from the great sages, great rabbis, explaining the forms of the various letters. The forms of the letters themselves reflect the 20. It is written reflects this spiritual energy that is contained within the letter, and we find in many places in Chassidus the shapes of the letters are used to explain things. The shapes of the letters are indicative of deeper realities, etc. The only thing I don't understand is what this note is adding to our chapter. That's the only thing I don't understand. Or that's at least I think that's the only thing I don't in this note. But there's just an interesting note that this is clearly referring to the Assyrian script in which our Sefer Torah is written now, right? Which is interesting because if you know a bit of the history, the Assyrian script is not the only script that we've ever had, and it's not the only script that the Sefer Torah has ever been written in. Prior to the Assyrian script, there was something called the Semitic script, which was the same letters but formed differently. And this is a very interesting idea in Jewish history. The Assyrian script was instituted as the rule by Ezra, not by Moses. Right, the time of Ezra, the time of the ingathering from the Babylonian exile. So we're talking, a few hundred years BC. Assyrian script, as it's called, that we have now, that we've used. Now, obviously, it doesn't really make a difference to us whether it comes from Moses or from Ezra, right? Because it's divine either way. It's just interesting to note that this is a common theme that often raises questions for the various rabbis and the commentators on the Talmud. This is not a secret, I'm telling you now. This is not a closely guarded
talking about the Hebrew letters?
Rabbinic controversy. The letters have always been the same. There's always been an Aleph and a Beis and a Gimel. Qumran is much later. Qumran's Bayis Sheni. The Dead Sea Scrolls come from the time of the Second Temple. We're talking about First Temple, after destruction of the First Temple. So it raises various interesting questions. For example, the Gemara says very famously that one of the miracles of the 10 Commandments was that they were carved through from one side to the other, which means that the mem sofit, the final mem at the end of the word, and the samach, which are round letters, if you carve all the way through, that means they have a piece that's hanging and levitating in the middle. And the Talmud says this is one of the miracles of the Aseres HaDibros, of the 10 Commandments. But what do you mean? The 10 Commandments it would stand to reason, were not even written in the Assyrian script. They were written in the earlier script, which we know what it looks like, by the way. And that's in that script, the final mem and the samach are not round, so that you wouldn't have this miracle. And for the answer to the question, go learn that piece of Talmud.
Thank you very much.
No, but the general gist of the answer is that many opinions say that in fact the 10 Commandments actually were Assyrian script, and that is exactly what the Talmud is coming to add. That is in fact the point of the Talmud, that the 10 Commandments themselves were Assyrian script. It was only the Torah scrolls, if I recall correctly, that were written in the other script. A whole thing, a whole back and forth. The bottom line is that the letters are extremely meaningful. The forms of the Assyrian letters denote the spiritual nature of each of the 22 letters, and the Kabbalah speaks endlessly about the significance of the forms of the letters, etc., etc.
Yeah, especially by the Torah, that not all the letters are the same. Some are small letters, some
Correct.
big letters, sometimes
Correct.
it's like
Downs,
Right, yeah.
upside downs,
Yes.
all sorts of
Dots on the top.
dots on the top.
So are there 22 forms of energy?
Yes.
That's it, if that's a limiting number.
Yes, well, and the 22 derived from 10, which is even more limiting, right? The 22 reflect the 10 divine traits, right?
What about Matzabach?
Oh, he's saying there's 5 final letters. Yeah, okay, so you could up it to 27 if you were feeling limber, and we'd have to study Chassidus to figure out why we normally call them 22 instead of 27.
Actually, when you look at the Gemara, even the punctuation has values. So those should be considered as well.
There's the punctuation, the vowels, the different tropes, the way the tune in which and the crowns on top of the letters and the various letters of the Torah. And all of these, I assure you, there is no shortage in Kabbalah. You can go crazy. It all has.
Oh, yeah.
Don't be afraid to investigate. There's endless. You won't outrun. You won't run out of resources on these topics.
Yeah, and then you mentioned like sometimes Shulchan is written with Vav and sometimes with
Correct.
Vav.
Sometimes Malay, sometimes
and it's in the
Chaser.
same Shulchan.
Oh, that's before we even get to the Kri and the Ksiv. Sometimes you read it different than it's written.
Right. Nar, Nara, yeah.
So if you had to characterize
Yeah.
two extreme forms of energy as depicted by two separate letters.
Yeah. It's a tricky question. I don't know. And the reason why I don't know is because it stands to reason you would pick the first and last letters of the alphabet, right? For example, you would think it stands to reason those denote opposite ends, literally, of the spectrum. However, as we are about to talk about in a second, the ends are actually related in a different way. So I don't know how you would find the two most opposite letters. I'm not sure. It's a good question.
I didn't understand the question or the
Any
answer.
two? Aleph and two different letters.
Maushal.
Letters that have two different energies.
יש אנרגיות בשונות, העובדה שזה ראשון או אחרון.
Is there a way of characterizing?
Yes, there is. So, for example, you're saying what is an example of qualitative characterizations of the letters? That's what you're asking. So Yud. So, for example, in Hashem's name, right, you have a Yud and a Hey and a Vav and another Hey, right? So the Yud and the Hey at opposite ends. Just for example, this is a 30-second example, right? The Yud and the Hey at the opposite ends characterize two divine traits. One of wisdom is the Yud, and one of majesty is the Hey. Why these two letters? Because the Yud is essentially a point. In the script form of the Torah, it's a point. In other words, it's not actually a point, it has a shape, but that shape is the starting point for all letters. So it's just the start, it's the single point of which a letter can consist. So it is like wisdom, which is the single point of insight, the flash of intuition, right? It's not expansive. As opposed to majesty and kingship is the expansion of the single concept into a nation, essentially. So the Hey is built like a house, right? If you think of the letter Hey, right, it's shaped like a house of sorts, right? So it is representative of the Yud, but expanded. It's as if you added space in the center of the Yud and expanded it, you get a Hey. Right? And so to the Vav is a Yud, but it's a Yud where you kept drawing down. The Vav becomes a line rather than a point, which is very indicative of other things, right? In other words, the forms of the letters, this is very, very basic. It's way more complicated, but this is just a general idea that the different qualities that the letters convey are in their shapes. Okay? That's what the Alter Rebbe says in the note.
Like the Aleph is 2 Yuds and a Vav.
2 Yuds and 2 Vavs.
2 Vavs.
Okay, let's read. So now that we know that these letters each represent a divine power, and the letters combined together form the creation, we get to the central thesis of the chapter the Alter Rebbe is going. The qualities of each particular creation in all the foods, in the 8 million types of bugs, right? The quality of every different type all derives from different combinations of these letters, and therefore all these differences in the letters. There are differences in the way the letters are drawn forth and arranged. Kagain derech mashal, for example, says the Alter Rebbe, top of page 988. The words in the statement, let there be a firmament. Why is this the example the Alter Rebbe is using? Brownie points for whoever tells me the answer. Why is this the example of the divine state, the divine utterance that the Alter Rebbe has chosen as the example here? Let there be a firmament. Any guesses? Going once.
Keep reading it. It explains it.
No, it doesn't explain why. He expands on the example, but why is this the choice? Why Yehi Rakia? Why not Yehi for example? Going once.
That's a question again?
Why the Alter Rebbe is going to give an example with this divine utterance, Yehi Rakia, let there be a firmament or let there be a heaven. Why is this the divine utterance that he's chosen of let's say of the 10, right, from creation? Why is let there be a
can represent one of the 10 spheres.
Yeah, but each one of the 10 represents one of the 10. Why is this the choice? It represents Gvura, but there's no particular reason why he would choose Gvura, divine self-discipline. Why is this the statement he's chosen here? You have to think in the past. The reason he's chosen this statement is because way back in chapter 1, when we are talking about the teaching of the Baal Shem Tov, that says that God's words are constantly creating the world. What is that based on? It's based on a Midrash Tehillim, and that Midrash Tehillim is based on the verse Le'olam dvarcha nitzav b'shamayim. Your words, God, always stand in the heavens. The heavens are the example, the original example of God speaking the world into existence in Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. Right? It's retro. It's a throwback. Right? This was the original example of Alter Rebbe in chapter 1, and now it's his example here in chapter 12. He says, so God says, let there be a firmament, Yehi Rakia, shenivro behen sheva rakiyim v'chol tzva shamayim asher behem. That with this statement, God creates the 7 heavens and all of the tzva shamayim, all the hosts of heaven, them. Right? The 7 heavens. This is a concept with which you're familiar. This is not even Kabbalah. This is Nigla. This is the Gemara talks about the 7 heavens. Right? Kamaim Razal, as the sages say, I think Shchakim Shebei Rechayim Omdos V'Teichnes Man L'Tzadikim. There is a heaven called Shachakim, in which millstones stand grinding out manna for the righteous. Man. Whatever that means, I'm not going to explain it because I don't know. Zvul sheba Yerushalayim u'beis hamikdash u'mizbeach. Then there's a heaven called Zvul, in which stands the Jerusalem and the temple and the altar. Right, speaking about the spiritual nature of these things. Obviously, we're talking about a spiritual heaven, right? Machin, there's a rakia, which means institute. Sheba which contains the storehouses of snow and the storehouses of hail. And you can read in the Gemara about, you see here, Chagiga 12b, that's the Gemara, to look up all the rest of these things. What's interesting, I'll just note for you, the Rebbe says it in his long note at the end of the chapter, which you can read on your own time, but it's interesting because the Alter Rebbe is bringing a particular opinion in that piece of Talmud, which says that there's 7 heavens. There's a whole other opinion which says that there's 2. I believe it's Rabbi Yehuda and Reish Lakish. It's a disagreement. And the Alter Rebbe sides with Reish Lakish, but he's not doing that on his own authority. He chooses Reish Lakish because the Zohar says that Reish Lakish is correct and there's 7 heavens. So the Kabbalistic position is that there's 7 heavens. And in fact, there are many commentaries on the Talmud and on later texts which say that really they're not arguing at all. It's really not a debate. They're not arguing on the facts of the matter. They're arguing on ways of looking at them, etc. Okay, so you have the 7 heavens. These 7 heavens are spiritual realms. Don't ask me any questions about these descriptions. I don't know what any of them mean. There's 7 spiritual realms, and these 7 spiritual realms that are called heavens, firmaments, rakiyim, right? They are all created by God saying, "Let there be a firmament." Yehi Rakia. Let there be a firmament creates all 7 of these different realms and all of the different things that are within them, which is the reason the Alter Rebbe is listing some of them. Because the Alter Rebbe's point is that all of these seven heavens are actually different. They're not a uniform thing. This is a multifaceted thing that is created by God saying, let there be a firmament.
One utterance.
One different of things, right? So the question is, where does the diversity that is within these things come from, right? In other words, where do you find the different types of the different aspects, the different creations that are described here, the different spiritual levels within these things, if it is a single statement that makes them? Yehirakia, God says, let there be a firmament, 7 different, totally different universes pop out, right? God doesn't say let there be seven. Doesn't say let there be 7 different things. He says let there be a firmament, and all of this diversity comes out, right? So where does this diversity come from? Continues the Alter Rebbe. Sheklolos harakim nivro v'chai v'kayamim b'chlolos tevas elu. The general heavenness. I'm reading it I'm reading the Rebbe's interpretation into these words. Again, see that essay for more information. The general heavenness is created and lives and exists from these words in general that are stated, let there be a firmament, right? In other words, there is an aspect of each of these different 7 heavens which is the same. And that's what makes them all heavens. That's what makes them all rakim, right? That's what makes them all firmaments. So these 7 firmaments all share a certain... A heaven is created by this statement, let there be a firmament, right? I'm at the top of 989 now. But the details of the creation of the 7 heavens, nivra kol prat mehen v'chai v'kayim me'ezet tziruf osios metevas elu. It is they are created by virtue of the combinations of the letters from these words, or their substitutions, or their transpositions. In other words, where does all the diversity come from? Those letters are manipulated. As we discussed in chapter 1, linguistic manipulation results in different creations. If you rearrange the letters or exchange some letters for other letters, right? You come a different name, and the name of the thing determines its nature. So all of the different precise heavens that are contained within that statement all derive from different combinations and different exchanges of letters. I just want to remind you in chapter 1 that we discussed there's many different types of called atbash, where the beginning of the Hebrew alphabet is connected to the end of it, right, where the first letter is exchanged for the last letter, and then the second letter for the second to last, etc. There's exchanges based on, for example, the hemoitzois hapeh, that the letters are grouped by which part of the mouth be exchanged. There's gematria, there's the mathematical sum of the yield of the letters by which they can be exchanged and equaled, etc., etc. So there's many different ways, really an inconceivable, when you put them all together, an inconceivable number of ways to exchange the different letters, switch them around, shift them, all different things that you can do. And the length of the further the manipulation goes from the original statement, the lower and more diluted the divine life force within the thing that it is creating. So if you only have to switch 2 letters in the word Yehirakia, right, to get the name of the next thing that you create, of the heaven that you need to create, then that heaven will be very high to that original, close to that original source of godliness. But if you want to go down to the, angel of the lowest heaven, if there is such a thing, you would go with many different exchanges to get down to that smallest reality, and each one of these realities gets its life force from a different combination of these letters. That's where the diversity comes from. Shehen kefi bechinas chayus hanivra haprati hahu. And the different arrangement of the letters is according to the precise nature of the creation that it needs to create. Okay, let's go forward. Kikol shinui tziruf u'arkavas v'arigas hakoiches v'chayos b'shinui. The different changes in the letters is a different interweaving of powers and life forces in a different form, right? You interweave by changing even the order of the letters creates a different interweaving. Arigas, the language is a language of weaving, which is interesting in itself. A different interweaving of the life forces is produced by changing the letters. Shakol eis hakedemes betziruf hi hagoiveras v'hi ikar bebriyazu. Whatever letter comes prior in the arrangement of letters is the one that is dominant and the main aspect of that creation, right? Everything follows after the first letter. The first letter is very determinative, which is why, if you study the Talmud, you will see, as that actually says brought in the footnote here, in the lessons in Tanya, footnote 6, that is why the Talmud says that we recognize in Torah the idea of Reshet Tevis, the idea of acronyms, right? Or more precisely, acronyms is when they form a word. So what's the initials, I guess you would say. Initializations.
Not abbreviation.
An acronym is like SCUBA.
What's abbreviation?
The UN is not an acronym, but a SCUBA is in precise English language anyway. So the initializations, the initial letters of words, the Talmud says is actually halachically relevant. The sages of the Talmud recognize that there is such a thing as initializations. That one word could be 4 words with the initials put together. The reason why, Kabbalistically, the Talmud recognizes that is because the first letter of the word is extremely dominant. So in other words, you can get rid of the rest of the words and string the first letters together, and you would still have the main part of all of those words, if you understand what I'm saying. Okay. So the Alter Rebbe is giving an example of why even the order of the same letters is very important. Having the first letter sets the tone word. V'hashar tfeles elea v'nichlalus be'era, and all the other letters are secondary to the first one and included within its light. V'alidei zeh nivrais bria chadasha, and thereby, by changing the order of the letters, you create a new creation. V'chein b'chilufei oizeus or tmureisei, and so too through substitution and transpositions of letters. Nivrois brios chadashos b'chutei amayla be'erecha nivroim me'isias atzman. You create new creatures that are lower than creatures which are created from the letters themselves. As I was saying before, the actual letters in the divine utterances create general and high creations. Let there be a firmament creates the heaven in general, right, which is a vast and inclusive. We see how large it is by putting under that category all of the individual creations which are in it, which are uncountable, right? So too with most of the other utterances of creation are like that as well. Let there be fish in the sea. That's rather general, right? With the diversity and the amount of things that creates, right, is astonishing. No one particular being included, or even type of being included in that statement is fully expressing that statement. The statements create the general category, general type of thing, and then it is by the exchanging of letters that you get to particular creations.
Dag is only 2 letters, and you have like millions of cars of Dagim.
Right.
Of course.
From Leviathan to Sardine.
Yeah, exactly.
From Dag, Mishtot
Yep.
But Dag is also the God, which is Mazal. It's 7, that's why we eat Dag on Shabbat.
It's what?
7, Gimel Dalet 7.
So Alter Rebbe is going to give a metaphor of what it's like when you exchange the letters, right? Because it's interesting. If you're creating something that none of its original letters are in the original word itself, right? It's entirely a switching letters through these linguistic rules, the letters themselves. So it's interesting because on the one hand, the divine name, the letters which go on to create this new thing are not included in the original word. So on the one hand, it's separate. On the other hand, there is this logical connection that allowed one to be transformed into the other, right? There's this sort of logical process which I'm not sure if it's really open to human understanding. Understanding without any boundaries on this process will quickly find that anything can be turned into anything else. So where does the order even come from, right? In other words, so there's some sort of secret to that. We're describing it from the surface level, right? Clearly, God is choosing to make a gematria here rather than a switch. What does that mean? Who can say, right? That's a profound question, which the Alter Rebbe is not going into here, right? All we're saying is that if you do yield a new result through whatever this process is, on the one hand, it has none of the original letters, so it's not found within that word. But on the other hand, there is a logical connection, there's a causal connection of some kind, which we don't really understand, at least not from this, that is connecting the second word, to the original word. So what's a metaphor for this? So the Alter Rebbe explains. Kihen derech mashal, last line on 990. Kihen derech mashal dugmas hameir belayla be'aretz min hayareach. It is, for example, like the light which shines at night, shines upon the earth at night from the moon. Hayareach u'me'ashemesh, and the light of the moon comes from the sun. Top of page 991. The nimtza shal haaretz hu ha'er shel hashemesh. We find that the light which reaches the earth at night from the moon is the light of the sun. It's not the light of the sun, it's the light of the sun, right? There's a certain interruption. It's not the same, it's not the light of the sun direct, it's the light of the sun in reflection, right? And clearly it's obvious to anyone who has tried to look at the sun and anyone who has looked at the moon that qualitatively the light is not the same, right? The light of the moon is a different light than the light of the sun, very simply, even though, what is it? It's the light of the sun. So here you see, you have both aspects. On the one hand, only from the sun. On the other hand, it's really a new light. It's such a rearrangement that it's really totally of a different quality. That's how you get a different particular creation. When God says, let there be a fish, and that statement eventually, one of them is a sardine and one of them is a whale, as Eyal said, right? The reason that's possible is because each of them is a different type of moonlight. Each of them is connected, reflects that is that original statement, but it's that original statement, let there be fish, brought down to a detail, brought into a particular, smaller, lesser light. It's the light of a light. It's connected but different, connected but separate in a sense, right? It has both of these aspects.
But this is different than what we spoke before, the previous lessons, because we said like Keren Or. It's like coming from the same source.
Yeah.
So, but it's only like one among like infinite.
Yeah.
So this time it's like different because you take the quality of that simple Karen and you actually.
It's an emanation.
It is an emanation, correct? So I'm saying this is different from what?
So because we said Karen is like coming directly from the sun, and that specific Karen doesn't change. It's like it's.
Right.
This time it's different.
Right. That is what we're saying. We're saying that the divine light which is in the utterance is changed into many, many different forms. That's where the multiplicity in the creation comes from. The many, many different types of things. The light is lessened. It's a form of tzimtzum, right? It's a form of contraction, lessening.
I wanted to say that, but it's not, because it's completely different quality.
That is one type of tzimtzum. One type of tzimtzum is a completely different quality, right? When we say the tzimtzum of, for example, just this is parenthetical for those who don't know what I'm talking about, but if you do know what I'm talking about, the tzimtzum of the mesech, right, the primary type of tzimtzum within Seder Shtalshalus, which is compared to a screen, like if you put like a very, very fine mosquito screen in front of the sun, or even better, like a Japanese, like a rice paper screen, right, in front of a light, right? So that's a form of tzimtzum, and Chassidus is emphatic that the quality, it's not just the quantity of the light that changes, it's the quality of the light as well. It's really not the same. It's a different type of light. Whatever that means, and that has to be gone into. Then you get into the statements in Kabbalah that I'm gonna mess it up, so I won't say it. But different levels are like different. One thing is like seeing the sun, and another thing is like seeing the sun in a room with a window, and then there's like seeing the sun through a wall with a crack in it, right? So there's all these different contractions.
But that's like the same, but even coming through a cloud.
Yeah, sure. So in other words, I think what throws us off is that we think sometimes of what's a quantitative change. We don't really think of it as a qualitative change. In Chassidus, it's viewed as a qualitative change. It's not the lesser amount of light by itself does not constitute it's a broader discussion. The lesser amount of light does not constitute a simple decreasing in quantity. The lesser quantity also implies a decrease in quality, which is it's a abstract concept that is difficult in several areas of Chassidus. It's a tricky thing to wrap your mind around. Chassidus thinks about this slightly differently than the modern mind does, which is not so rare. There's many places where there's different things like that to struggle with. Okay, but we get the general idea. The general idea is that it's like the light of the moon. It's like the light of the moon. The moon is interrupting and making a different quality, a lower quality of light. The kacha derech mashal, Alter Rebbe will say it in his own. Kacha mamish, so too literally derech mashal by analogy, right? Which, by the way, is a paradox of phrase, which has much has been written about, right? Kacha mamish derech mashal. This is found several times in the Tanya, which means so too literally by way of analogy, right?
Oxymoron.
Kacha mamish derech mashal, so too literally by way of analogy. There are some who say, by the way, that if you can understand this turn of phrase, you understand a great amount of Chassidus. In other words, this phrase encapsulates a profound of Chassidus. Kacha mamish al derech mashal. Maybe we'll talk about it sometime, not tonight. Kacha mamish derech mashal. So too literally, by way of analogy, the letters in the divine utterances include the life force and the light and the vitality which is drawn forth from the divine traits. Livrei ha'ilum esma'in liyesh, to create the worlds from nothing, for something from nothing, and to give them life and to sustain them as long as that is His will, His blessed will. And from that general and great drawing forth of from that great divine expression, God causes to shine forth from it and draw forth from it offshoots. Told us literally means children, offspring. Offspring is the word. Like it, offspring like it, and branches off of it. Shehein told us from Shachas HaYichud, which is the offspring and drawing forth of the light from the letters. The hein chiluf ha'esios v'tmuna zein, and these offshoots from that general light are the exchanges of the letters. And that is what creates these specific creations of each world. V'chein heir Hashem eid v'hemshich v'herded ha'ara me'ha'eres ha'esias. And so does God shine the light forth further in another manner and draw it forth and bring it down, array of array of array, from the light that is within the letters. The kain himshich eid, and then he draws it down even further, v'hirid, and descends it ad lamata mata, to the lowest place, bebechinas ishtatus, in the entire order of the world. Ad shenivra hadoimim mamish. The Alter Rebbe comes in for a landing, so to speak, at the very end of his work. He says, until the inanimate matter itself is created, ka'avanim va'afar, like stones and dust. Right? From dust you were created, and to dust you shall return. And is true of the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah as well. We started talking about stones in the first chapter, and we are back to talking about stones and dust. We've come down to chapter 7, talking about the infinite light of God before the Tzimtzum. We've been coming down, descending since chapter 7, and we have made it to the bottom. Stones and dust. V'shmeisei and Evan v'afar, their names are Evan and Afar, stone and dust. V'hem chilufim de chilufim, these are exchanges of exchanges. Chulu, the tmuros, substitutions of substitutions. Canal, as we said before, how do you get these lowest of all creations? By switching and exchanging the letters. Nishlam chelik shein Hashem yisborech v'yis'ala. So does the second part of Tanya end with the help of God. May He be blessed and exalted. So the Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah ends on stones and dust. We've worked our way all the way back down. And what was the purpose of that? What was the purpose of working all the way down to stones and dust? Because finally, in chapter 12, the Alter Rebbe finishes his argument that he really began in chapter 7. In chapter 7, the Alter Rebbe said, God is absolutely one, and nothing that He emanates, nothing that He creates contradicts that unity, because the tzimtzum is non-literal. The divine self-concealment, the divine self-removal never really takes place. God's infinite light is present here as it is before He begins to create. And then He has spent the rest of the work, since chapter 7, explaining that at a conceivable level. He starts infinite light before the tzimtzum, and He comes down and down and down. He says that the 10 divine traits are absolutely one with God. They pose no contradiction to the divine simplicity and the divine unity. Where we see 10 different traits, God sees just further expressions of His infinite light. Then we said that it's not just the divine traits, but even the divine speech. The divine speech comes forth to express those traits, and that where we see differences in the different words God says, God just sees a further expression of His traits, right? A further expression of that one godliness. And now we said that not just His speech, but even in the things His speech creates, down to an individual speck of dust in our universe, what does God see there? What gives that dust its soul and its vitality and its nature? A combination of the divine letters. That's all that this speck of dust is. And that combination of the divine letters is just a combination of the divine speech, which is just an expression of the divine traits, which are absolutely one with God. So in other words, we make our way back to our world to exactly where we started, and we conclude with the exact theme with which we began as well, that the world is absolutely one with God in every way. We've come around to this fact from a totally different direction, as I said at the beginning of the class. We've now explained this from the top to the bottom up, which actually lends, which is vitally important, as we'll discuss more next week. It's vitally important that you explain it both ways. It can't just be from the bottom up, that leads to issues. It has to be bottom up and top down. You have to work your way up to God and then work your way back down to the world. But the theme is really one theme of this work. It's Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah, the gate of unity and faith, that nothing that exists in this world exists in any way at all separate from godliness. And this is a very appropriate theme to talk about on the week of Yutas Kislev, the week of the publishing of the Tanya and the revelation of Chassidus in the world. And also, God willing, Chanukah is coming up. It's also a theme of Chanukah. So, Mazel Tov to all of you, and thank you very much. Next week we will be summarizing this entire work, and we'll be discussing what we are going to do next. God willing.
But in that case, how do you differentiate between the material thing, like the body itself, and its soul?
Oh, I was actually thinking about talking about that during the class, and I decided I won't talk about it unless someone brought it up. And now here,
He brought it up.
Here in the end, no, but a very good point. A very good point. We actually did talk about this earlier, but I forgive you for not remembering because it was a very long time ago.
I don't forgive myself.
The distinction between physical and spiritual that we normally conceive of in Chassidus is a much more blurred or entangled line. The answer to the question is that most of what we think of as body is actually also soul. That's the first step. And secondly, even when you get to something that is actual body, right? What's the last thing the Alter Rebbe says? Stones and dust, the inanimate, right? Matter itself is also an expression of the
but this is cycle.
divine.
From where you came from, you return. There's no change.
Yeah.
But the soul,
No.
This is something else.
No, the soul is something else. That's what I'm saying. I'm saying there is a distinction, but ultimately the matter is no different in this respect from being absolutely one with Hashem. The only question is how it gets here. And if you study different Maimarim, different discourses of Chassidus, you'll see much more clearly a distinction made between Chomer and Surah, matter and form. And in fact, the Rebbe has a very interesting letter, by the way, where the Rebbe talks about how, in fact, very similar to the theme of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah in this last chapter, how the vast multiplicity of reality can be explained by very few principles. And really it's a principle in Achdus Hashem, right? We see the unity in the multiplicity. The multiplicity is not a contradiction to the divine unity, right? Which is the theme of one of the themes of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. So here we say in this chapter there's 22 principles, right? But the Rebbe has a very interesting letter where he talks about how science itself, regular science is converging to this same reality, because it used to be that the Chachmas HaUmas, like for example in ancient Greek, the non-Jewish knowledge was to say that every force in nature and every little thing, depends how idolatrous they were, but there was a point where every blade of grass was a god, everything was its own principle, right? Everything was a god. There's a god of houses, a god of lightning, a god of this, a god of that, endless, right? Endless lists of God, like the Hindu 6,000 gods, and the Japanese, the Shinto, they believe every hill and rock and stone is a god, right? And in Iceland, they still don't build the highways in a certain way because they don't want to disturb the elves, right? Because every elf has its little house. I don't know, whatever. All the Mishigassen, right? So that's the old way of thinking, right? The Goyim used to think, the non-Jews, the non-monotheists, let's say, used to think that there was a different force and a different power within each and every different creation, and totally different, right? And constantly in conflict with one another. If you actually study their mythology, right? Most of it's about war. They're always fighting, always in conflict. Modern science, right, which the Zohar says, and the Rebbe explains, that there's a corresponding wellspring from below, just like the wellspring of Chassidus from above, that the non-Jewish knowledge and the Jewish knowledge of the inner Torah are actually approaching each other as we get closer and closer to Mashiach, long story short. So, as the Rebbe writes in this letter, science itself has concluded that all of the multiplicity we see around us can be explained by very, very few principles, very similar to the theme of chapter 12 of Shaar HaYichud v'Emunah. And in fact, the Rebbe writes there that science has actually, when the Rebbe was writing this back in the 50s, science has decided that everything really only expresses two principles, which he says are matter and form, like I was telling you before, soul and body, right? And the Rebbe says, and in science, these are called energy and matter, right? Everything in the world, in physics, right, if you break it down to its physics, everything is just energy or matter, which is soul and body. So the science is actually, the Rebbe wrote, is doing this same process of winnowing down and coming to fewer basic principles by which everything is explained. And the Rebbe says this is a great advance in Achdus Hashem, the unity of God in the multiplicity of the world actually finds a vessel in science. So I hope that speaks a little bit to your question, at least about.
When you refer to the soul of the body, did you speak about the nefesh be'emit or something else?
It's complicated. I'm going to end my recording here, actually. Sorry, everyone on the recording.